Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. Thanks for coming together for another episode of the ABAP Freak Show. I'm joined today by my friend and colleague, Rich Hallman. So say hi to everyone, Rich.
Hi, everybody.
um, I hope that our audio is good again this week. Um, we've tinkered with it once again. I felt so confident after last week's show and mostly having the audio straightened out that we'd try a guest again, which of course complicates the audio further. But hopefully all is okay. I'll keep an eye on the chat. For today's show, we have we have an oldie but goodie, I guess you would say. The topic of ABAP Object Oriented, and I'll tell you a little bit of how this came to my mind to talk about this week. Well, first and foremost, I'll do a little promotion here. Um, that we just last week finally released the code samples that go along with the ABAP Object Oriented video series that I did on YouTube last year, late last year. And this was actually a 10-year-old, more than 10 years old, e learning series that I had done. I think this was part of the original ABAP Freak Show many years ago. And, um, and of course, it was very low resolution. But people were still watching it on YouTube, even though it was like, I don't know, what was the resolution, like three, 300. It was very hard to read because this was back in the days. Actually, I produced this, I think, on Blip TV before YouTube really supported this sort of thing. Um, and, I got a lot of requests to update it just to make the video quality better. And when I did that, I also did it on Steampunk and changed from the original video series was using SAP GUI SE80, and I changed it to ABAP development tools. But yeah, the source code is out there now. That to go along with this, it took a little while to get approvals and get it posted and stuff like that. But it is out in the official SAP samples. So that got me thinking about object oriented. So maybe Rich, let's talk about the history of it first of all, of object oriented, because I'm still kind of amazed that to some people it sounds like something that still feels new. Would you agree?
Well, um, I can comment to that. Those of you that know me know that I started out working at SAP customer um, around the 2000, 2001 timeframe. I started learning ABAP, and I spent 6 years at that customer doing ABAP. And it was only until my last year at that customer that I wrote my first class. Yes, that's right. So the entire time I was writing report programs, um, module pool programs, not using basically, okay, so I used, some of the existing classes, but I never wrote my own classes or interfaces
Yeah.
until like the last project that I worked on. And for whatever reason, I said, well, okay, I'm going to try something different, and I did that. But I didn't actually use classes because nobody else in the company was using them, and um, I guess I wanted to stay with the normal flow of everybody else and not go outside the bounds of uh, of our development process and cause problems for other people, because I mean there is a small learning curve in my opinion, um, when it comes to using classes and interfaces, but it's not something that can be overcome. That can't be overcome. Um, so like I said, I spent 6 years not even touching them, other than just calling some of the existing ones. Um, so it is very, very, very real that it could be that there's still folks out there that are, I don't want to say stuck in their ways, but they're focused in their ways. of staying in the SE38 world, um, or creating module pool programs. So I think it's more common than what we think,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. I mean, based upon how many people asked for the videos to be updated, I've recently joined a Facebook group for ABAP developers, which has been pretty interesting. A lot of discussion there on learning OO still today. And I just want to look at the history here. Let's put this in perspective. I went to the Wikipedia page for SAP R3 to look up dates of when releases came out. So, and my memory is a little fuzzy here, but check me if I'm wrong. The first bits of OO, if I remember right, came in 4.0. That's when you could do local classes. There was no global classes yet, if I remember right, and there were some other limitations, but you could do some very basic things in 4.0. And I'm a little fuzzy there because I don't think I ever actually worked much on a 4.0 system. The company I worked for at the time, we were on 3.1, and we stayed on 3.1 until we went to 4.6. We skipped over 4.0 and 4.5, which I think was relatively common in those days, that a lot of people made that kind of jump. But
Yep.
so the
I started on a 4.6C system,
yeah,
so
so the first roots of ABAP OO, we're talking about April of '98. They were introduced. Now, I could even make the case that most people probably didn't take it seriously or even begin to take it seriously until 4.6C. 4.6C was sort of the milestone release for technology in its day. It was the Ho Enjoy, the SAP GUI controls that were OO based as well. So I think that's when adoption really started. We had global classes. I think we had a lot of the functionality we have today in ABAP OO, not all of it, but the basics were there. And of course, we had the form-based class editor was introduced, I believe, at that point, or maybe it was further refined to that point. So we're talking there April of 2000. So maybe we could cheat a little and take that as our starting point, because that's easy to do math from April of
mhm.
2000. Um, and I actually remember going to training for 4.6C, and my wife was pregnant with our first child at that point, and I was a little scared to go away to go to training then, but that was in 2000, so that all coincides with my memory as well. But so we're talking about a technology that has been widely available for 20 years. And I think that's something that's interesting about the SAP world. We
Mhm.
had a similar discussion the other day, um, on an event on Friday. Um, we were actually talking about ABAP development tools in Eclipse and
Mhm.
how so many people see that as the new tooling,
Right.
and it's
10
been
years old.
it's been available for more than a decade, and here we are talking about ABAP OO. Do some people still feels relatively new, or they're still learning it and things like that? But it's 2 decades old, 20 years old, and I don't know too many other sectors of technology where the time scale is quite like this. I mean, maybe other enterprise software, maybe that's the case. But if you compare this to, say, open source software, what stuff that's going on with Google, their time scale is in months, and our time scale is in decades.
Mhm.
And I think that's both a blessing and a curse, because that's part of what gives us the backwards compatibility, but it creates such a long tail of knowledge too that sometimes that's hard to deal with.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah. So I mean, so you said you started on 4.6C, right? Uh,
Yep.
uh,
Yep.
and when you started doing your OO, what were you on there? Was that still 4.6C, or had you guys upgraded?
No, that's the thing. I was stuck on 4.6C for 6 years, and by the time I moved on to SAP, I think NetWeaver 640 was out or something like that.
Yeah.
So all that time,
2004S.
yes, yes, exactly. So I went all that time without really touching classes and interface other than the consumption of them again. But yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, I think. It was fun to go down memory lane there, but it's important to put it in this historical context of how long it's been around, and yet, there's some adoption curve still going on there, which is always interesting. But I also wanted to talk today with you, and everybody in the audience is welcome to join in. We got a nice audience with us. Feel free to ask questions or throw in your ideas. I'm going to be glancing around a little bit as I keep a little closer eye on the audience than maybe I normally do, because I don't have a whole lot of prepared demo. But we wanted to kind of just delve into some of the concepts of OO and talk about pros and cons and things like that. And I know there's going to be a little bit of a lag before you see my screen, Rich. So I'll not move super fast from one thing to another. But I guess, maybe let's start with the tooling, because I think there's some controversy here, if you will. There's some debate between the ABAP development tools, which of course forced people into a source code based class editor, and those that are still maybe clinging to SE80 or SE24 for the form based editor. And I think that came up recently in a discussion, the pros and cons of each of those. But where do you come down on that?
Well, I mean, I could see the argument because when I started with SAP, I did nothing but create new classes and whatnot, and I solely used SE80 and SE24 to create classes, and it was all the form based, and I got very used to that. But at some point, I started using the ABAP development tools and creating classes with the source code editor, and I didn't really miss the form based. So the transition was easy for me. Um, I just I felt it natural for whatever reason. I felt a natural progression towards the source code editor and ABAP development tools right away. I'm sure that's not the case for everyone, but I didn't really have a much of a struggle to go from one to the other. I mean, I'll be honest. In some cases, I did flip the switch
Mm-hmm.
in SE80 to source code just so that I could scroll through it all
The whole
quickly.
thing.
But
Yep.
yeah, but for the most part, when I was creating those methods in SE24 and SE80, I was doing it in the form-based editor. But again, transition for me wasn't that big of a deal.
Yeah. I like DJ's comment. If you're going to do OO, then at least use the code based approach. If it's much better, source code systems such as Git. Yes, I think I would have been shocked. I'm surprised, DJ, that you weren't creating your own ABAP console to do ABAP OO coding back in the day. But yeah, it certainly does match up to some better to some modern concepts. Although it would have, yeah, I mean, it was always there before with the form base. The source code was there behind the scenes, just it just hid some things from you. I still find personally that some things like the short text, um, the way that we have to do it in ABAP and Eclipse, the ABAP development tools feels a little disjointed. The If you want to put short text descriptions on your methods and things like that, and it's a legacy holdover. I mean, it has to conform with the way that it worked in SE80, so it doesn't feel terribly natural in the source code editor. I was a little resistant at first too. I really liked, particularly the definition side uh, of the class-based editor, defining your attributes and methods in the guided approach to the form-based editor. I still find myself um, handicapped a little when it comes to writing methods. I'll admit method definition signatures by hand,
Hmm.
just from years of dependence on the form-based editor. Um, but I do find navigation so much better between using the outline and some of the other tools. Maybe And I reset my perspective the other day. I normally have a lot more views open here, like have like element info and things like that, that give you more details about what you're in. Like when I select a class and I've got the information about the class method. So I found over the years the ABAP development tools gives you nearly the same experience. Like I said, other than I found that the definition side is, I feel like I'm still missing some support that I used to have in the form-based editor, but other than that, I've grown mostly comfortable. And but I think it's a learning curve. That was the one thing when I switched to ABAP development tools that I would cheat sometimes and still go back to SE80 when I was mainly defining a new class. Yeah, and then maybe code it up in here. But I found if I force myself over time, I've gotten pretty used to it.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, it seems like we have a pretty good lively debate going on the chat between the
Hmm.
form-based editor and the source code-based editor. I figured I was going to touch a hot
Uh-huh.
spot there if I brought that up. Yeah, yeah, that's good. So, any other closing thoughts on the tooling before we talk about some of the syntax?
I don't think so.
Yeah, yeah, um, yeah. I like the fact. Someone asked, "Is anyone in the chat born before 1990?" Or I'm sorry, born after 1990? I don't see or after 2000. Did anybody answer? I don't. I don't think anybody answered. Did they? Are you saying we're all a bit old on here? But actually, I have the YouTube statistics broken down by age of viewers, and yeah, we do skew slightly older. I think that's the SAP world for you.
Hmm.
Um, I see an interesting question here, and actually, this was on my list to discuss. Persistent classes.
Oh, yes.
Does everybody remember persistent classes? I guess I should have dug up an old example. I don't have one handy because I don't use them anymore either.
We had a whole chapter about that in the book.
Yes, we did. There was a time when persistent classes, and those of you that maybe aren't familiar with this, what would happen is you would um, generate an ABAP class, or actually it was three classes, um, and I can't even remember all the ins and outs. It's terrible because I wrote about it, like the agent and
Like
the act.
Agent
Yeah,
One.
yeah,
Yeah.
and it would represent a persistent object, a single like database table. And you would have your OO access to the table instead of writing SQL to say do insert updates deletes. You would pass through the persistent objects. And on the surface, I really like the idea of sort of abstracting away your persistency. It gave you a very common OO approach to things. You were able, instead of having a table full of data, full of records, a table full of object references. And then you could loop over that table to access the individual data in a record as attributes of that object. So it really turned data access. It made data access object oriented. Um, but it has fallen out of favor. I guess, or maybe it never reached deep adoption to begin with. So maybe what are your thoughts on that?
Oh boy. Um, I don't want to get in trouble with anybody.
No, go ahead.
Uh,
I mean, I don't think it's really recommended anymore. It's probably still supported for backwards compatibility, but I don't see it used even in SAP supplied code anymore.
I wasn't a fan of them when we wrote the book,
Yeah.
and I'm still not a fan. And the only time I've ever used them is when we wrote the book. Um, what I thought it was a unnecessary over engineering concept, in my opinion. It didn't have to be that complex to do what we were doing there.
Yeah.
I saw in just the chat there just a minute ago on DOAs, data access objects. Now we did something similar like that for the BPC project, where we created our data access layer. So it was kind of like a persistent object. It's just that we didn't use the framework to do that, but it was just a regular class, and everything flowed through that class that was associated with the insert, update, and delete, all the CRUD operations for that particular object, and we just called that the DAO layer. Um, so we just kind of wrote our own. But as far as having the framework generate all of those setters and getters, and for every column, I think it's got I think it just got too complex in my opinion. I don't think it helped. I don't think it helped simplify your code all that much.
Yeah.
My opinion.
Yeah. And somebody in the chat I see, said it reminds them of Hibernate. I think it conceptually was very similar to some of these frameworks, similar to Hibernate or any of these database or SQL abstraction layers. But what's interesting to me, it feels a little like we've come full circle now. We fell away from that, and now we've introduced wrap. And doesn't wrap feel a little bit conceptually like the persistent objects, because you start with your data model, your CDS view, and then you generate, particularly the managed version of wrap, you generate a persistence a class that takes care of the persistency and the locking and the number, and all these things that maybe the persistent objects didn't do. But it feels similar, maybe not quite, to your comment, not quite as over engineered when it comes to the layers of OO there. It kind of goes almost the opposite extreme in that everything's done as a local class. Feels even less OO, but conceptually it does provide a layer on top of, so you're not creating your own persistency.
I've never thought about that until now, so thanks for that. But I've never drew the correlation between the two. I guess because it's a different time, and I just completely forgot about persistent classes. But yeah, I can see your point there, where we have this history of abstracting away lower levels, and we continue that today with the wrap.
Yeah. And somebody in the comments I see said, mentioned BOF, and to me BOF is in between there. BOF was an early predecessor to wrap. Kind of as we go on this, once again, if we look at the historical journey, I think we started with persistent classes, which was taking a pure ABAP class OO approach to abstracting the persistency. Then we moved to BOF, which got us out of the pure OO class generation and more to a framework, or like just a reusable framework by SAP to wrap persistency, WRAP, not RAP. And then BOF evolved based upon the needs to grow it. Things that were done as reusable classes have now been moved into the ABAP kernel. And we've formalized things, we've added things to the ABAP language in order to create wrap, which is to me just an evolution of the concepts of BOF, but done in a more technically performant manner in many cases. Would you say that that's accurate flow of things? Yeah.
Yep. I mean, we continue to say that the what was it called? The ABAP programming model for Fiori, I think was the name, which is based on BOF, is the predecessor to wrap, and wrap is the programming model moving forward.
Yeah. So, just as a side note here, Uwe suggested that in ABAP development tools, it's easier to read the source code based editor if you activate the colors. I've never used this feature before. I just turned it on by his recommendation. My first impression is it's It's very colorful. It's
Like the rainbow.
yeah, it's a rainbow effect. I'm
Got
not
a bag
sure.
of Skittles laying
Yeah,
around
I'm not.
anywhere?
I'm not sure. I like the range of colors. I probably would have to go through here. Something about this yellow and this green is really very bold choices. Let's put it that way. I think I would have to customize these colors for my personal preferences, but I get what he's saying here. That it helps to mark the different sections of the class pretty well. I do like that fact. I was not aware of this feature. I can't say it was something that I was pining for myself personally, but yeah, I think I might go in later and customize the colors so they're not quite as bold choices. But I like the suggestion there. That's a good suggestion. Thanks, Uwe. Um, yeah, I'm just checking the chat here real quick as we progress.
You think you burned DJ's eyes with that?
Yeah, did I hurt his eyes?
Yeah.
I know it's not monochrome. I'm sure you could customize it to be monochrome grayscale or something like that, DJ. I know we kid hard, don't we? So yeah. Let's see what we've hit on so far. We've talked about somehow we got all the way from persistent classes to BOF to wrap. So that was a progression that I know I wanted to touch on. Persistent classes was actually one of the top of my list that I wanted to talk about today. Maybe while we're there on the subject, global classes versus local classes. Tell me your
Yes.
thoughts.
So here we go again. I don't want to. Yeah. So this came up on a call the other day, and I let my feelings be known. Um, so the guys that have been working with the RAP, the RESTful programming model, you know that the behavior implementations are done with local classes, and I made the point to say that I'm not a fan of the use of local classes in this situation. And this is not the first time that we as SAP put something out there as a framework for developers to use that kind of forced us into using local classes. But for me, in this day and age, I would have thought that we weren't going to do that again, but we have. So I'm not a fan. I think it's a little ugly. Um, um,
Oh, somebody in the chat just brought up local classes inside a function group. Ooh, ooh.
oh, see now we're just yeah. I gotta go take a shower.
That really
Uh,
feels like mixing concepts, doesn't it?
yeah. So you see my point. You start getting into some ideas here that you just don't want to. It's a path that you don't want to really go down, right? But as it was explained to me, as I thought, the reason for using local classes in this case for the RAP was about technical implementation, and I get that. Um, doesn't mean that we can't spend some more time on it and figure out other ways, but it does work for the purpose that we're using it for today. But not a fan. Never was a fan, and probably will never be a fan. I'm all about throwing stuff out there that can be reused and tied in with other things. And when you do those local classes like that, um, I think that defeats the point.
There's an interesting comment in the chat that in the development tools in Eclipse that it doesn't. They feel that it doesn't feel as different global classes versus local classes because it is all source code based editor, and I think that is part those of us that are a little bit older and maybe worked a lot in SE80, SE24. Local classes definitely had the detriment that they weren't in the class builder form based interface, and I think that's part of where some people's reluctance to them stems from. I know that personally I have some prejudice against them because of that, and they do not feel quite as different now. To be honest,
Yeah.
for me, I think it's a mental thing. I just feel, I don't know. I'm a little bit. I like things very organized in my programming, and I feel like local classes. This is gonna be odd. Maybe sound odd. They feel messy.
Hmm.
They feel not as organized. I like organizational blocks. I like to be able to I don't know,
Yeah, I get it.
controlled grouping. Yeah, you get it. I don't know how
I
many
get
people in
it.
the audience have similar feelings, and it's yeah, it's a total mental thing here, right? And I just feel like they feel a little out of place, and I'll admit something that I probably shouldn't here. I have a tendency to shy away from things like even test classes more than I should. Or not shy away from them. I know I should write test classes. I do write test classes. I feel not right about it when I'm doing them as local classes. You know, even though that kind of makes sense to group it as a local class with its main class. I get the idea, but it just feels wrong somehow. Anytime you go about using local classes. Yeah, and like I said,
Yeah.
maybe that's partially the holdover from the legacy of SE80 and how they were treated so differently from an editor standpoint there. Um, yeah, let's see how it's going in the discussion here. I figured this would be another one that would spark some good discussion,
Yeah.
but
Um, Barbos just posted something. For me, it's still a newbie to ABAP OO using local classes within a report program help to bridge the gap. That I agree with that.
yeah,
Um, Especially like working with the old first starting out at SAP, I started using the old CL GUI AOV grid,
yeah,
right? And we had to do the oh geez, the event handlers, right?
right,
With local classes, and that
yeah.
that did help me. That did help me the same way to bridge the gap between the two.
You know,
Yeah,
that didn't last very long for me. I know all the instructions I learned in Joy controls with local class event handlers. I very quickly figured out how to do it with global classes though.
oh yes, I
And
think you
moved
wrote
to
a
that.
blog on that, right?
Yeah, and moved to
Yeah.
global event handlers. I took all that stuff, all the stuff that I felt like I was forced to use local classes for, and I tried to figure out a way to use global classes back in the day. So
That's because you're a rebel.
yeah, yeah, I know.
Now you follow the rules.
Yeah, I know. Oh, the good old days of rebelling when, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, when you're a customer, you can rebel a little bit more, can't you?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So, yeah, another very interesting topic in this area. It feels like we come back around to this every once in a while, where we feel. I mean, it seems like every time we do something on the wrap, when we talk about it, present on it, that's one of the first questions that come up is why is it all done in local classes? You know, and so I think it's a fairly common sentiment that people don't feel that that's a natural path to immediately go to local classes. But
Mm.
yeah,
Yep.
yeah, yeah. So let's see. Screen management. Regarding screen management, which is the recommendation with OO, not to do screens
Yeah.
in ABAP anymore. I mean, if you want to talk recommendation from SAP, is that classic DinPro is dead for all intents and purposes for new development, and you should be. I mean, these days, I guess we should all be doing UI5 Fiori, right? I haven't done. Oh, when was the last time I created a new screen? Even an Enjoy control thing. It's been a couple years, I have to admit. And particularly
Well,
now that
to
I've got ABAP, I mostly use Steampunk. I don't even
yeah.
have SAP GUI.
Just to kind of answer the question there, I this is a long time ago, so you're testing my memory, but I did employ OO concepts in doing uh, like a very simple um, module pool program. But the only thing I really did was modularize. So inside the PBO and the PAI, I simply wrapping that logic um, with the same name
Hmm.
methods, right? So
Yep.
it's just, and that's really all you can do. You can't really take it, you know, all the way. Um,
Although there was an old, I'd have to dig up the blog. There was an old class framework that would translate DinPro events, the PBO PAI events, into ABAP OO events.
mm,
And it was, you could tell it was like something, and I don't have any background here because I think when this came out, when I discovered this, I was still a customer, so I don't have any inside information. But I look at it from the outside, and it was like somebody started to experiment with doing an OO version of DinPro, and a few of the classes got out there in the wild, it feels like, and then probably BSP and WebDinPro and things like that came along, and that was all de-invested in. It would be interesting to know the history there. I've never spoken to anybody
yeah.
in the ABAP group that worked on it in those days to that extent. But there was, and I would imagine still. Maybe I'll have to pull up that old blog because I know I did a blog on that when I was a customer. There was a bridge there that lets you do ABAP OO for PBO PAI. Not that I would recommend doing any of that new today. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Oh, somebody ALV does use classic exceptions. Maybe that's another one to talk about. Exceptions.
Which one are we talking about? The
Yeah, which
old ALV? Or are we
ALV?
talking about the ALV object model?
The reuse function module, the
Right.
CL GUI ALV, the what's the newer? Uh,
CLSALV
yeah,
table or
yeah,
something like that.
yeah.
Yeah.
And isn't there? Uh, is there a new one, or did we just add a method to it? The one that has the HANA specific functionality in it too. I always have
No,
to.
that
I
is a
always have
new
to
one.
go look up.
That's
I haven't.
that's like IDA or
Yes,
something like that is
yes,
the name.
yes. You
Something like
you
that.
can tell where I got out of my day-to-day ABAP programming. I haven't written very many reports with the newer one. I remember the class names and function module names of the old ones, but I don't remember the newer ones offhand. I always have to go look them up myself. Um, but let's talk because the question came up, and I think that's a good bridge over here. Is exception handling,
Mm.
um, class-based exceptions. How do you feel about those? Um, yeah, as opposed
I
to
never
just
used
throwing exceptions.
never used them until I joined SAP
Yeah,
and worked on the BPC project, and then we use them all over the place. And then I became a fan. So yeah, I
became a
dig it.
fan because of reusability, or
I think so because we had I mean, it was fairly easy to use because we had we had like a framework in such a way that and it was very organized, right? So I mean the exception structure was blown out to the T. You know, I mean it was very organized, so it made things a lot easier to do. But um, yeah, I mean it was just a matter of a lot of times you could just copy and paste a lot of those lines of code and just reuse across. I mean, not in all cases, but you just grab something that some other developer has done and paste it in there, and you're good to go. But um, I became a fan after using them here at SCP.
yeah. I think this is another area where I'm showing my age a little here that I didn't take to them right away because once again I was so used to not having them that when they came along it felt like a lot of overhead to define the exceptions in advance in a reusable class. It's definitely one of those things where pay me now, pay me later. That it does, I think, pay off in the long run for reusability, better structure, better consistency in the exceptions and the messages that get thrown by those exceptions by forcing you to have to define them. It was without it, it's too easy to just I'll just add another condition here on the end of my method or function module or whatever, and not have to go somewhere else and define them. I think it forces us into good good patterns.
Yeah. And that was the idea for the BPC project, was to force all the developers um, to align into this single, not single, but um, this level of organization when it comes to the exceptions, messaging, and things like that.
Yeah, yeah. Wow, I'm trying to keep up with the chat here. We're getting so many good suggestions of
Yeah,
topics to
they want
talk
to talk
about.
about a lot of things. What one thing that I wanted to bring up, and I thought that somebody would have brought it up already, but is there time to maybe discuss constructor versus factory method
Oh,
concepts?
well, somebody did ask singletons,
Oh, okay.
abstract, topic of singleton classes, and somebody else asked here
Oh, I missed that one.
about abstract. Yeah, a difference between abstract and interfaces. So yeah, I think they're kind of all lumped together there. So yeah, well, let you start the discussion then.
Yeah, so for me, I mean, this goes back to when I was learning Java. I really, for whatever reason, I hated constructor, right? I hate constructor methods.
Yeah.
I don't know why. I just don't like it. So when I first saw this, the concept of creating a factory method and creating an instance um, within that factory method and whatnot, I was like, well, that's kind of elegant. I kind of dig that. And and this was back when this is back before we had the new syntax where we were forced to say create object, right? I didn't like that. I didn't like that syntax either.
Yeah,
I wanted it to be much more clean and streamlined,
which it is
um,
now.
which it is now.
Yeah.
But at that point in time, we didn't have that new syntax, so I was always used the factory method to return an instance of my class, and then continue processing, and everything was nice and elegant. So I got very used to doing that. And if anybody ever looks at any BPC code, BPC or NetWeaver code, anything I ever wrote for that product, factory methods all over the place. So yeah, I dig the factory method as opposed to the whole the create object and using the constructors and whatnot. But now that we have this new syntax, it's not all that
If you were only
it's
using it to
for
avoid the
elegance.
syntax,
Yes, yes,
then
yes,
yes, the
right.
usage is reduced. But I mean, I think there are other use cases. I mean, the
Yep.
concept of polymorphism, that a class can take on different features depending upon its use case, that it can reshape itself, but without the consumer of that object knowing or having to know which state that it's in as it morphs, is very powerful. And we do have an example of that in the OO examples, where we have an abstract class and we have a factory method, and because we're representing different planes. This is the flight model, right? And we want different logic to be performed depending upon the type of plane that we're working with, whether it's a 747 or an A340. We want different logic to be executed, but we don't want the calling program to be aware or need to process that difference. All it needs to say is, for this flight, I want the price calculated, but it's a different calculation, and that should all be hidden from the consumer and part of the class logic, and the class can adapt itself based upon which data it's being instantiated for. So the constructor method takes an input key, this is the flight number, and then it decides based upon that flight number which subclass it wants to return. So these ideas, when we get into these more complex ideas of abstract classes as opposed to just an interface. An interface allows you, and interfaces can be part of an abstract class or one of these factory methods. It gives you a common fixed interface, but an abstract class goes beyond that, because you can include logic, particularly the logic of the factory method, for instantiating the child objects that come out and create the morphed child that takes on the state and the alternate logic. In this case, we have two different classes. We've got a 747 class and we got an A340 class. But the calling program never knows that. It doesn't have to deal with that fact. It simply calls the factory method, gives it a carrier ID and a connection ID and a flight date, the keys to the data, and the factory method is going to look up the data, but also return an instance of the object that is specific, the morphed in the polymorphism, the morphed instance of the class, yet the calling program works at the base level, and it never has to know the specifics of the child classes, and it will just get the right output and call the different method implementations. And to me, this is a very, this is a pretty powerful concept when we think about it in business terms. Yes, this is flights. Sometimes people use cars, different models of cars, to explain this concept. But think about it in terms that I think are more businessy. Sales orders. If I'm returning sales orders, I have different order types. I've got standard orders, I've got return orders, I've got replacement orders. There's different order types. I could have a base order class, and then I could morph that via polymorphism into more specific logic for the particular order type that I have. Yeah, someone's commenting on my select star there to keep things simple in this example, but yeah. So we could probably go down a whole set of things here. I always find it humorous when you get into these deeper OO concepts. You start getting into things like friends. Someone brought up the concept of friends, which I've only used personally. I have used a handful of times, but it's a fairly rare use case where you want to allow protected access outside of your inheritance chain. So it's like your protected objects, your protected attributes and methods can only be accessed by child objects in your inheritance chain unless you declare a friend, and then the friend can access. I find that's usually when you're getting into these more complex frameworks where maybe the SAP is supplied a centralized framework and you're using it and you need to create this relationship that doesn't come through the direct inheritance chain. So you get into all kinds of interesting situations, and often they are in support of these framework concepts. Did you guys use much of that, friends, in your frameworks? I'm trying to think. I've used it 2 or 3 times where I thought, yeah, this is a really good use of that.
I don't think I've ever used it.
Yeah.
Might have tried to use it when I was trying to hack something, but I don't think it ever worked out.
Yeah. Yeah. Uwe brings up a good concept, overloading. True overloading like we have in other languages. I think that is something that personally I miss in ABAP. I think there's different cases here. I've heard the argument inside of SAP that overloading is an evil thing, and that it's been left out intentionally because it leads to what would you say? Not inconsistent. What's the term I'm looking for here? It leads to ambiguity.
Ambiguous.
Yes, ambiguous situations where it's hard to determine. But after years of working in JavaScript and Node.js, it feels like we're missing out on a little something there. The ability to overload and shape constructors. I mean, there's different workarounds in the ABAP world that people use with different methods, inheritance, even like factory methods to do things like that. But yeah, we've definitely, and I think it is intentional. I mean, I've heard internal debates about that, where we thought about adding that kind of functionality, and basically came down on the side that overloading is ultimately not wanted. Yeah, we're nearly out of time. Yeah, I support the evil theory. Work on the same code. I don't know. Wow, there's so many different threads here, and I don't want to jump into another one that's going to take us way past our time. But one I thought, let's pull out one last one. I'm going to scroll back up a good ways here. It caught my eye earlier. Not maybe not directly OO, but it did stand out to me. The question from Abdul here: um, alternatives to custom RFC to WSDL.
Ugh.
Uh, so, what would you do in an OO world without with the technology we have today? Steampunk. Let's even throw in that wrinkle. What would you do for that sort of thing? And maybe I'll tell you what my first thought was: HTTP handler, just an HTTP endpoint,
Hmm.
and then put your function module inside there and just generate a lightweight REST endpoint for that RFC. If it's a read only, a get endpoint. If it's a update, then a put or post patch kind of situation. To me, that feels the most natural, lightest weight approach to exposing what the RFC did.
And we've made it so easy to generate that service now. So
Yeah. I mean, I guess the alternative would be generate a whole wrap OData service for that, but that feels a little
might be overkill.
overkill if you already have, particularly if you already have a function module and you just want to expose it as though it was an RFC. I would think the HTTP endpoint would be the better choice, and actually then kind of nicely aligns because then you got a class. To tie this back into our discussion of OO, like you said, it's so much easier now to do that. Um, in steampunk in particular, but then you have the class, you have the inherited interface of the HTTP handler, and you can just focus on exposing the logic there. So I think that is a really lightweight but nice usage of OO in that context.
Yep.
Yeah. So I know we didn't get to everybody's topics. I hope everybody enjoyed the discussion, though. It's a little different than maybe what we've done in the past couple of weeks, where we set out with a very fixed demo and we coded some stuff start to finish. This was more meant to be a conceptual discussion, and I hope everybody enjoyed that different approach to things. It's nice to mix things up. I think we got people talking in the chat and interacting with us. That was one of my goals for today. Are you laughing at DJ's comment?
Yeah,
How can you
yeah.
talk about the overkill while not acknowledging what WSDL represents? Yes, yes. Well, that's why I personally lean into the REST approach there. I was just ignoring the whole WSDL part of that. And SOAP. I mean, I guess that would be a discussion for another day. But I think thankfully those of us that lived through the enterprise SOA era are happy to see lighter weight protocols than WSDL and SOAP reigning supreme these days. But that could be a topic for a whole another day, wouldn't it?
Hmm.
We could really trigger DJ there if we started talking
Hmm.
about enterprise SOA, I think. But yeah, let's go ahead and wrap things up. We're nearly at the top of the hour. I don't want to keep people past time here. But thank you for joining us today, Rich. Thanks for the lively discussion in the chat. It's been really excellent. And I hope everybody, yeah, DJ, get me on that discussion.
Hmm.
I hope everybody's enjoyed the discussion today. I'm certainly certain that we'll do more of these in the future. We talk more conceptually. Certainly, as we saw here, sparked some nice debate, and I hope everybody learned a little something here today too. If nothing else, just a history lesson. Listen to the old farts talk about ABAP from 20 years ago, huh?
Yeah.
All right. So thanks for joining us for another episode, and we'll see you again next week.